we're delighted to be here today and to present our work to date. I suppose some introductions first. My name is Jenny Berrill. I'm Associate Professor of Finance in Trinity Business School, but I do have strong connections in Maynooth in that I did my undergraduate there. So I did the BA in Economics and Finance, and I also did my Master's in Maynooth, my MA in Economics and Finance. I won't give the year, it's quite a while ago, but I'm currently, as I say, Associate Professor in Finance in Trinity. I do most of my teaching on the MBA, and I also teach mostly at postgraduate level, mainly in the finance area, and corporate finance and risk management would be the main ones I teach. And my research areas began, I suppose, in finance, but more recently have moved into the areas of finance and well-being and mental health, and also the very sensitive area of suicide, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Before I start, I might hand over to Damien. Would you like to introduce yourself, Damien?
I'll say something brief. Most people, I've probably met most people at this stage, but I'm in Maynooth about a year. I'm with the Faculty of Business since February 24. Like Jenny, I'm a graduate of Maynooth as well. We both graduated about 5 years ago, I think. This is 5 or 6 years, I'm not sure which. But we were classmates on the Masters in Economics and Finance. And unfortunately, like, we stayed in touch, but we only started to research the last 5-6 years, and it's been really productive. So after my undergrad and work experience and the rest, my PhD training was in labor economics. So Jenny went into more finance. After her master's, I went the economics route. So we kind of have a nice mix. So initially I would have been looking at, like, some of the questions here today, like labor market discrimination in this paper, or these papers look at the marginalised group we look at as people, transgender people. But when I was doing my PhD, we were looking more at migrants in Ireland at the time, because we had data for the first wave of migrants into Ireland, and we wanted to see how they were getting on. And the two of us have kind of made this. It was a strategic choice, really, to move in towards mental health, well-being. Some of it is to do, I think, with PhD fatigue. That, you study one thing and you get tired of it, and you need to move. For me, I had to move the dial onto something else to feel invigorated again. And in particular, the last couple of years, I think that's been my case. And it's we're working with some nice people as well, which we might talk about later. So I think I'll hand back to Jenny then, because she's going to lead with the suicide work initially.
Great stuff. Thanks, Damien. So this is a little bit slower. So we've done our introduction. So what am I going to say? So just to give a brief overview of the presentation today, and Damien has pretty much covered it, but I'm going to first talk about business performance and suicide. Then Damien's going to pick up there and talk a little bit about the area of transgender studies. And then Damien will probably take the lead, but we'll both talk a little bit about our other completed and future work and where we see ourselves going in the future. So this is a little bit slower than I'd hoped, but we'll keep going. So just, I suppose we are acutely aware of the sensitivity of the area of suicide. So please don't let us sound like we're in any way dismissive or diminish it in any way. So we're very aware of the sensitivity of this topic as we work through the presentation. So why did we decide to research suicide? Well, we began in 2019. Well, for me, I read these absolutely shocking statistics that more than 47,500 Americans died by suicide just in that year. It's the 10th leading cause of death for all ages. It was the second leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 10 and 34, and the fourth leading cause of death for individuals or people between 35 and 54. The suicide rate in the US increased by 33% from 1999 to 2019. So, I mean, those statistics, I say, they're absolutely shocking, and they caught our attention immediately. So we wanted to just look at these there and see, what are the main causes, and is it related in any way to the economics and finance aspect of the research that we do? What was particularly striking was the situation in the US, because although globally the suicide rates were falling, since 1999, suicide rates in the US have continued to increase. So there's been a lot of studies as to the hows and whys, but as I say, globally they're falling, but in the US they continue to increase. So we're going to look at US data in most of the analysis that we do. So why did we focus on the economics of suicide? Well, as Damien says, that's our main area of expertise. But again, there was quite some startling facts to look at. So psychiatric disorders, they have obviously well-established role to play in explaining suicide, but more than half of the people who died by suicide between 1999 and 2016, they were not diagnosed by a mental health disorder at the time of suicide. So over half were not classified as any mental health disorder. So while psychiatric illness does have a role to play, obviously, it doesn't completely explain suicidal behaviours. So we wanted to essentially investigate, does economics and finance come in and have a role to play in this? So comprehensive, the Centre of Disease Control and Prevention said that a comprehensive prevention strategies should go beyond just looking at mental health issues. Mental health issues do have a strong role to play, but what other factors can play or have a role in preventing suicide? So while all of our analysis and our papers are focused on suicide in the US, that was mainly due to a data availability issue. And I suppose the fact that suicide rates in the US continue to increase. Just as an aside, and based on what we're saying today, we just said we'd provide some statistics on suicide in Ireland. Well, the occurrence of mental health issues in Ireland increased rapidly, and the level of suicide have increased by 525% between 1950 and 2013. More recent figures suggest that death by suicide has been declining, thankfully, with a rate falling to 6.8% in 2020, down from 8% in 2017. So it's still high, but it is moving in the right direction. UNICEF Ireland reported that 86% of young people in Ireland do claim to have suffered with a mental health issue in 2011. Just to look at some graphs in relation to suicide in Ireland, the older stats, so from 1950 to 2013, you can see the total numbers have been increasing, particularly in the 70s, 80s, 90s. You can see that dramatic increase in suicide rates in Ireland, driven mainly, as you can see, by male suicide rates, which is the orange line, which increases almost in sync with the total suicide rate figure. The figure for females is a little bit more stable. It has been unfortunately increasing, but it's a lot lower and a lot more stable than the male suicide rate from 1950 to 2013. When we look at more recent figures from 2000 to 2019, we can thankfully see that reduction in suicide rate looking at the top line. And again, the male suicide rate almost mirrors the total production rate or the total suicide rate, but you can see that fall from 2010 onwards in suicide rates. A very similar picture again emerges for female suicide rates, where it's quite similar or quite stable, much lower than the male rate and relatively stable over time. So as you can see, for the Irish figures, they're mirroring the overall global figures, and that there has been a reduction in suicide rates over recent times. However, what we want to do is we want to see, is there a link? Is there something that finance or economics can help with or provide a solution to the suicide rates, and also in relation to mental health? So what we decided to do is look at some innovative, well, we believe they're innovative research questions that might serve and critically engage with real business practice and public policy. We wanted to keep our research as practical as we possibly could. We wanted to hope and aim to provide some policy implications and hopefully get these figures moving in the right direction. So with that in mind, I'm going to review 3 papers that we've looked at in relation to suicide and business, as I say, focusing in the US. The first paper we're going to look at is Business Performance and Suicide in the US. This paper was published in Social Science and Medicine, which is a 4-star ABS journal. It's written by Rawada Abdu, Damien, myself, and Jim Hanley, who's based in TU Dublin. It's the main selling point, I suppose. It's the first population level study which links business performance and suicide in the US. We want to take a broad overview. We want to look business performance and suicide. We essentially measured business performance using the S&P 500, so the main stock market index, and we came up with 2 alternative hypotheses. So one hypothesis, which was the one I believed would hold but actually didn't, was that as the S&P 500 index increased, businesses would be performing better, which may lead to an increase in employment, better economic conditions, which would hopefully lead to a fall in suicide rates. The alternative hypothesis was that as business performance increases, as the S&P 500 increased, people were working harder, becoming more competitive, which may lead to low job control, burnout, and long working hours. So we noted that the working environment in the US has deteriorated significantly over time. You see people working harder, longer hours, and more pressure, I suppose, in an attempt to maintain competitiveness or even increase competitiveness within US firms. We found that actually the second hypothesis turned out to be true, and that there is a human cost in terms of increased suicide rates associated with improved business performance. So as the S&P 500 index increased, as firms in the US started to, I suppose, improve, profit increased, as competitiveness increased, the suicide rates also increased, particularly among males and females aged 15 to 34. So it seemed to have a greater increase or a greater impact on younger males and females. We suggest that our findings speaks to the importance of promoting quality of working life and to raise the awareness that it's not just profit that's important. There's a wider impact of business on society. As the profits of firms increase, we need to be aware of the impact that has on employees. You know, we need to promote policies that help employees to manage stress, that, you know, a better work-life balance, and so on. This paper it was published, as I say, in Social Science and Medicine, which we were delighted with. It's, I suppose, given the relevance we felt of the results. It was also mentioned in Forbes magazine and HR Network magazine, and in the Conversation Kudos. So it got widespread attention, not just in academic circles, but in the wider, I suppose, sphere. That gave us good, I suppose, inspiration, and we moved on to a second paper which looked at the relationship between economic uncertainty and suicide. Again, this paper was published in Social Science and Medicine, and it's the same authors, so Rawada Abdu, myself and Damien, and again Jim Hanley. And in this paper, what we wanted to look at was the relationship between economic uncertainty and suicide in the US. So we measured economic uncertainty using the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, the EPU index, and we wanted to see what happens to suicide rates as economic uncertainty increases. So as you would expect, as uncertainty increases, it has a negative impact on mental health, and suicide rates also began to increase. However, what we wanted to look at specifically was whether this relationship was symmetric or not. So whether the negative impact, I suppose we looked at previous studies which looked at negative news having a greater impact than positive news. So we wanted to consider if an increase in economic uncertainty had a greater impact on suicide rates than an increase in economic stability. So whether the negative news had a greater impact than the positive news. And unfortunately, we found that yes, that was the case. We found evidence of a presence of negativity bias. So in other words, when economic uncertainty increased in the short run, that it had unfortunately an increase, led to increase in suicide rates. However, when economic uncertainty fell and the economy became more stable, that didn't have that same positive benefit in terms of economic suicide, its impact on suicide rates. So an increase in economic uncertainty led to an increase in suicide rates. However, when the economy became more stable, it didn't have that same positive effect in reducing suicide rates. So we said, again, we feel that this is a big impact for policymakers, because policymakers and employees alike should show that policies aimed at promoting economic stability following large increases in uncertainty are bound to fail. Okay, so we need economic stability, but once that economic instability occurs, the impact on suicides is more dramatic than an increase in stability will be able to reverse. So again, we felt there was a large policy implication from that study. The final study I'm going to look at again relates suicide, but this time to mortgage delinquency. So it's a paper written by the same four people, Rawada, Damien, myself, and Jim. We wrote a paper called The Association Between Mortgage Delinquency and Suicide in the US, and it's currently under review at the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking. With this idea, I suppose, occurred to us because during the foreclosure crisis in the US and during COVID-19, there was a large increase in home repossessions and mortgage delinquencies. So we wanted to have a look at that impact and see how did that affect suicide rates. When we looked at the existing literature, there was a large, I suppose, a large body of literature that said, yes, when a home is repossessed, that leads to an increase in suicide rates. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at the period before home repossession. So what about when homeowners are delinquent on their mortgage payments? What about the period before home repossession? And is that delinquency or that falling behind on mortgage payments, is that sufficient enough to be a risk factor for suicide? Is that something we need to look at in terms of policy implementation? So we looked at the association between not so much home repossession, but mortgage delinquency and suicide, again, in the US. And we found that, yes, falling into arrears in your mortgage repayments was sufficiently powerful to precipitate suicide. So we need to look at not just when home repossession occurs, but policy needs to be focused on that period before home repossession when mortgage holders are at risk of committing suicide. We found that this effect was particularly strong for older individuals and also for people who lived in relatively wealthy states within the US. So I suppose that relativity in that there was more shame associated with falling behind on your suicide or falling behind on your mortgage payments when you lived in a more wealthy state than in a less wealthy state. So we said that we call for more timely intervention in terms of policy. We think it's important to intervene, I suppose, be aware that the risk of suicide doesn't come when the home is repossessed. The risk of suicide is before that home repossession period. So our findings inform financial professionals dealing with delinquent homeowners about the mental health aspects and that their financial troubles. So our paper, so the selling point was that we identified a novel factor for suicide in that it's not home repossession, it's the period before home repossession. And we said that for, dealing with financial players who are dealing with these mortgagors should be aware of this, and we're calling for more timely intervention from the finance industry. So we're aware of what a sensitive topic suicide is and how important it is. And as I say, the reason we got into this area was the shocking statistics that I quoted up front and how suicide rates are continuing to increase in the US. So what can we do? Well, we can be aware that there's ASSIST training, which is applied suicide intervention skills training. While the mental health is an area that's, there's lots of psychiatric, I suppose, proposals in terms of building relationships, talking to each other, taking care of ourselves, and also taking care of each other. There's numerous things we can do to try and improve our mental health and reduce our suicide rates in terms of dealing with historic traumas, education, and so on. But I suppose what's novel about our research is that we're also trying to bring in financial and economic factors that may play a role and help reduce suicide rates in the US, particularly because they're increasing, but also on a more global scale. So I'm going to hand over to Damien now, who's going to talk about something quite unrelated, but another area of great interest for ourselves.
Thanks, Jenny. Before we talk about the labour market stuff, I took some notes as Jenny was speaking as well. It's interesting to actually see the work presented, because I haven't really seen it presented. I've usually been presenting it, or Jenny's been doing it somewhere else. So like I think Jenny alluded to this already. When we had a naive view of the relationship between suicide and the economy or the stock market, in that we were anticipating like a traffic light system. So we were hoping to come up with like hard numbers around, when the stock market falls by X%, you go into an amber space and people start to become alert to potential risk of suicide. And if it falls by a further amount, then we were going into a red zone, and we'd say, now people need to take real heed. And that's kind of naive based on maybe, movies and books where you see a stock market crash in the 1980s or something, and, people jumping off buildings and so on. And that was our kind of traditional view. But in fairness, older research was kind of lending to that debate as well, in that seemed to be the case. But as Jenny said, since the year 99 or 2000 in the US, suicide has been on the rise, and we didn't find that traffic light system. And we had a debate around naming the paper, is our work killing us? Like, is it so? In the past, a job was seen as being a protector from suicide in a recession, and now it's also a risk factor in a boom period, having a job. So it's something, I suppose, work-life balance needs to be worked out. We mightn't get to talk about it at the moment, but Jenny, myself, and Joe are working with a PhD student, and that's the space we're in at the moment. We're looking at productivity, and we're looking at productivity inducers, I suppose, and the relationship with suicide, and we're starting to see some interesting stuff. The other thing that's interesting is, for me, when I see the Irish data and the kind of the dramatic rise, it kind of reflects Irish society. So for people who've grown up in Ireland, say under traditional kind of Catholic Ireland, suicide was the ultimate sin, and in a way, it probably did two things. It probably kept suicide statistics lower, in that people were genuinely scared because of the religious consequences that they were being taught at the time, and obviously the shame that would come alongside that for your family. But also, I would guess that suicide as a result was underreported. So people may have passed away and maybe it wasn't discussed. So it's not that suicide wasn't present in Ireland, it was just because of the level of shame associated, we tended not to to focus on it. Today it's the opposite. From reading again, we see that how suicide is handled in Ireland versus the US is quite different, say, statistically. So when we're looking at this data for Ireland, we would always look at accidental death as well. Primarily because the police or the Gardaí would sometimes report would sometimes report suicide as accidental death if it's not clear, in order to protect the family, maybe financially, if there was a policy where an insurance policy was linked to suicide, maybe, or if it's just not clear. Maybe the guards have a fair idea that it's a suicide, but again, for compassionate reasons, they won't necessarily nominate it as a suicide statistic. Jenny and I met an American lady at a conference last year, and she had an opposite story where her son fell off a building in the US, and she was researching PTSD at the time as a result of that. But the police immediately recorded him as a suicide statistic, primarily to protect the owners of the building from going into some sort of insurance battle with the family. So if it's unclear, to protect property owners, they will label the death as suicide almost immediately. The traffic light system we did find then in the mortgage delinquency paper. I had a friend who lived in New York from about 19 years of age to 25, and he used to say to me, "You're 2 paychecks, you're 2 months away from being on the street in New York." So if he missed 2 payments on his rent, he'd be on the street. And in Ireland, we don't tend to have that. I mean, government put in policies to support families during the financial crisis to stop repossessions of homes. But I didn't like the 2-month thing actually came to pass in the research. We found that people who were delinquent over a 2-month period were at higher risk. So once you went past 2 months, then houses started to become repossessed. So that was kind of our traffic light research, as it were. Now that paper is under review at the moment. In my eyes, I don't know if Jenny agrees, but in my eyes, it's probably the most important piece, because when it's published, it's the sort of thing that you would hope could become policy. I mean, it's the sort of thing you would take to the banking sectors and say, look, this needs to be written into mortgage contracts, like some sort of duty of care from the bank towards the homeowners if they miss two repayments in a row, or some sort of duty of care. And even if that's not written in, if you make people aware of that, if you make the industry aware of that, if we shout about that loud enough, then if people go into if they lag behind in payments, nobody can say that that we weren't aware of this, and which is the whole idea behind research, I suppose. Is there anything else I'd written? Yeah. 2 more things, I suppose. The conferencing of this work is so interesting. Depending on where you go, and I've taken work like this, not necessarily these papers, but mental health work to economics conferences, you tend to get a very negative feedback. To the extent it's kind of like the wrong place for it, perhaps. And the sort of feedback I tend to get at those conferences has been queues of people asking individual questions after the presentation, as opposed to a discussion around the work. So people would tend to want to talk about their own mental health and their own experience. I think Jenny was at a conference last year, and there was an American lady came up to her to talk about her own daughter had gone into delinquency on her mortgage, and she was repaying the mortgage on her behalf, and then their relationship was faltering as a result. So the research we do kind of has real world implications, as a lot of research has, I suppose. But we tend to see that if we go to the right mortgage. The assist training that Jenny mentioned as a protector, I took that myself about 10 years ago, and after it I felt, God, it's the sort of thing that we should be asking transition year students in Ireland to participate in, because it's so informative and it makes you feel skilled. So you come away and you've got some, 4 or 5 basic tasks you can do if somebody comes to you and they're suicidal. So rather than feeling like I don't know how to resuscitate somebody, for example, if they collapse, if somebody presents with suicide, you go, right, and I do A, B, and C. This is what I do. And it's very simple, and it's research-based, and it's global. So that training is rolled out across the world. So it's really, really interesting. Okay, so we'll move on to the labour market stuff, the transgender stuff. And it's linked in a way. So it's very different in that the suicide data is like, it tends to be time series data. It's looking at, the economics and finance data. And then we're looking at time series for different mental health statistics, such as suicide. The transgender stuff tends to be more, let's look at individual levels. So let's look at people and let's look at how they're getting on. And it's hard to get the data. But what links the two things, and this doesn't come true in our research because we don't have this data, it comes true in reading in the background, is the link is trauma. So what I'm reading about, say, in relation to transgender people, is that people who are transgender often come with a significant trauma history. And that can just be the result of being different in a society where you're not necessarily understood. Or it could be the trauma of having to actually put yourself in a position where you have to go to your family and describe what's going on, and maybe that you're rejected, or maybe your community rejects you. So we're seeing trauma in the suicide studies. We're seeing trauma here. I suspect down the line, I don't know if we'll get there. It might be a PhD project to look at the interaction between the two things. But I think in general, that's where the research will go. Okay, you can move on to the next slide, please, Jenny. Okay, so the first piece of work then is the transgender labour market outcomes. I review reports for the ESRI, some of their labour market stuff. And I think it was 2018, I was reviewing one of their reports. And it doesn't change in a sense. And in most countries, it's the same as like whatever the gap is between men and women in the labour market in relation to pay and employment. It's pretty consistent across time. And it doesn't really change. And I thought, yeah, it's like we probably need to do something different. Either look at the question differently or whatever. And I was out for a walk that day, and it came to me then about transgender people, because there's no mention of transgender people in most labour market reports anywhere in the world. And when I came back from the walk, I did a quick search. And as it happened, a month prior to that, there'd been a meeting of social scientists in the Netherlands. And they came together to discuss how are we going to deal with gender on surveys. So it's no longer good enough just to put male and female down because of the way the world's changing. And they politely left a trail for me to follow from their slides. So they identified that there was only, at that point in 2018, there was only 2 data sets in the world that actually asked about gender in a non-binary way. And when I looked at those 2 data sets, both were freely available, but one had 0 economic or financial content. One was just a survey of people who were transgender and was just asking more about their own kind of background. And the other was an American data set that had just commenced asking about gender in a non-binary way. So this paper was with Clavs, Cypricus, myself, Jenny, and Clavs was a funded PhD student. So I rang Clavs that day and I said, look, I know we're working on, there's a paper further up here. I know we're working on this paper, but I think we need to stop and address this transgender question today. Let's see if we can do something meaningful. So the trade-off in a paper like this is the data is incredibly weak. So from an economics perspective, we were missing a lot of control variables that we would like to have in a basic economic kind of labour market study. But you have the premium of somebody asking gender in a non-binary way. So that was a trade-off. We didn't know how it would pan out in terms of reviewers and so on. But as it turned out, people didn't necessarily care about some of the missing variables. They were more interested in the story we were telling in relation to gender. So it was the first paper in the world to look at labour market outcomes for transgender people. You can go on to the next slide, please, Jenny. So there was a pecking order, and basically we found that it's kind of traditional pecking order, but we're looking at obviously with a new layer. So men are at the top in terms of who's most likely to be employed in this study. Well, men are at the top, women are next, and then trans people were at the bottom. Okay, so transgender were most likely to be unemployed and least likely to be employed. And we found that up to 64% of that might be due to discrimination. So in labour economics, so like this is debated. So you say it could be discrimination, but it could be something else, such as other factors we don't know. Okay, so we can't really label it fully as discrimination. There's other things going on. Even with pay gaps between men and women, you'd say the same in terms of framing the argument. And then we also find the same sort of pecking order when it comes to pay. So males would earn the most, females in the middle, transgender people would earn the least. Now, from reading about non-economic literature, again, this is back to trauma. I think people who are genuinely traumatized are they're in a weaker position to negotiate pay. Now, we don't have all the answers. What we've done is we've taken this for the first time. We're saying, look, this is what we're finding. There is a pay gap in the labour market. We all know about the pay gaps between the two traditional genders, but when we allow for transgender in our study, we're seeing that this group is the worst off. And the main problem, I suppose it says a lot about society. The main problem we have is data. So we don't have, like even today, like 6 years, 7 years on from this, it's really hard to get good data on transgender people in labour market studies. So we don't really know. And like, okay, if there's only 1% or 2% of the cohort that are transgender, we're doing them a disservice by not recording that. If we took the same approach with ethnicity, if we said 1% of the labour market in Ireland is Asian, and we said, well, let's just exclude them because it's only 1%, then we'd never find out how Asian migrants to the Irish economy were performing and how they were getting on if they were facing discrimination. I think it's to do obviously in the States, it's a very politicized issue. In some ways, kind of elections were fought over it. It's less kind of political in Europe, I suppose. But we're not probably dealing with it in a mature way at the moment. And there seems to be a lot of kind of a hot potato aspect to it. So that's my own experience, that it's still hard to get data. I was asked to sit on a review group. There's a Understanding Society data set in Britain, is a fantastic longitudinal data set. And about 2 years ago, they asked me to sit in on a review of their data and as a user and to give them some feedback with a few other people. And I raised that as a question, and they had asked it. They asked gender in a non-binary way in just 1 year, and I asked about that, and they said, no, it's coming. So I was told that this year they would start to collect non-binary, and they actually haven't. So again, I don't know if that's political or if it's something else at play, but it's kind of a reflection on us in society that we're just not able to ask people a basic question without it becoming some sort of ordeal. Now it will change and it will take time. But that's my experience. The paper itself, apart from, so it was part of Clav's PhD. He went on to get a PhD and he went on to work for the SRI. It was published in Gender, Work and Organisation, which was kind of a natural home for it. It was an ABS3 journal. It also ended up as part of legislation in Britain, in Westminster. It was used as a part of a report for the Gender Recognition Act. So they were looking at gender, and their committee used our work as in part of the decision making. It's also on the reading list in one of the Ivy League universities. I think Wharton Business School has it under undergrad economics and their MBA economics classes. So it's having kind of a nice impact out there, and it being the first paper out there, with time that's going to grow. You can move on, please, Jenny. So the natural angle for us then, I thought, was, well, we've looked at people in employment. What about self-employment? So again, we worked with the same data set. It did have questions on employment type. So we were able to isolate the self-employees versus employees. And again, from an economics perspective, I'd have issues over the quality of the data and the limitations of the modeling. But you know that's the limitation, and your benefit is, okay, we're having a first stab at looking at how are transgender people getting on in the labour market. This paper ended up, last November, it was published officially in Small Business Economics, which is again an excellent journal. An interesting journey to get it published. Every American journal that we published gave us like an immediate desk rejection. And I'm of the view that it's to do with the title, that American journals didn't want to handle this in an election year. Small Business Economics, which is probably more European leaning, they were super. And by the end of the process, one reviewer in particular, they were more interested. I don't know who they were. They were more interested in the process nearly than we were, getting it down to the fine detail. So as a journal, I couldn't recommend it higher in terms of how they respected our work and how they treated us as authors. The interesting thing here for me, and this is where we need to go next, I think, transgender persons may choose self-employment out of necessity to avoid adverse labour market outcomes. So what that's really saying is things like bullying, for example. And it's not just transgender people. There's research that talks about people with ADHD, for example, having the same issues, that I'm different. I'll go into this corporate environment. I'll stand out like a sore thumb and I get bullied. So people often will retreat into self-employment, not for economic benefit, but for protection. So I can create my own world and I can be self-employed and not face maybe the wrath of bullying. So often then you'll see there's research that shows this, that different cohorts, and we're working on this with another team at the moment, different cohorts will, so profit is not their bottom line. So as a result, they might come out with lower profit margins than somebody who's not transgender in the self-employed space. But what they're picking up is autonomy, independence, and better mental health outcomes. Okay, Jenny, you can move on. Okay, I won't say too much about this because I'm aware of time. It's 11:41. I'll just say one or two things about these papers. So CLAVS's funding was initially based on this type of work here, so the impact of mental health and labour market outcomes. And we saw and it turned into a transgender dissertation. It had a chapter also on this stuff here, the impact of mental health and labour market outcomes in Britain. And the results were, these papers are under review. The results are startling and interesting in that, so if you did have a mental health issue, you were facing a discount in your pay. The second paper, we won't get into it, also looks at occupation, and people were less likely to be in higher paid occupations. What was most interesting for me was that there was two different methods for getting people's mental health data. One was kind of self-reported and the other was through diagnosis. And people with diagnosis had worse outcomes. And what we don't know is whether that's a HR issue, so that maybe it's reported or maybe it's somewhere in a file, or is it just that your mental health is actually worse because you're having to receive a diagnosis around it. But that was kind of the key issue that stood out for me, that having a diagnosis, having a formal diagnosis, was having a bigger impact on your labour market success than having a non-formal diagnosis. Even though your mental health might even be worse, you might have had a diagnosis, but you might have a worse outcome. I think we'll move on, Jenny, to the future work, because with time that we've left.
Yeah, give me a second. I have to.
Yeah, no problem, Jenny, and feel free to jump in. So that's just what we were speaking about a second ago with the mental health studies. Okay, so we'll spend a few minutes on this maybe. And again, Jenny, feel free to add, subtract, whatever you want. So we have some papers done, we have some almost done, and we're some just beginning. I see Andre's here. We have a paper with Andre Van Stel and Marta O'Hagan, both from UCD. Well, Andre's with Kosminski in Poland as well. So that was looking at the self-employed and their mental health and well-being, but we were looking at it from a financial perspective. So if they had financial distress, so the self-employed had worse mental health outcomes as a result of financial distress relative to people who are employees. And again, that would make sense because you're carrying the burden of a company, not just a household. Then myself and Jenny and Jim Handley and Michael Chester, who's now in the UK, we looked at fuel poverty. So in other words, we're, in the US, who had access to heating, who didn't. Unfortunately, older people, again, were at risk. Like Jenny spoke earlier about older people being at risk with mortgage delinquency. So older people are at risk. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was a couple of states, of the 50 states in the US, there was a couple of states in particular that stood out as a sore thumb. I think Massachusetts might have been one. And again, that's something that's coming down the line for other countries. If we think of the energy crisis that we experienced the last 3-4 years, and people are making economic choices around cooking or heating, fuel poverty is something that in Ireland we'll be talking about later, I think, as time elapses. The migrant mental health paper is a PhD project with Ruben. So Ruben's a PhD student in Trinity. That paper was accepted just last week by Health Economics, which is again an ABS 3 paper. So myself, Jenny, and Ruben. And that's a really nice piece of research. So what Ruben was most interested in is if you're a migrant living in the UK and you're doing well yourself, so you have a job, you've got stability, what's happening to you as a result? What's happening to your mental health if what's going on at home economically is bad? So if your economy is tanking back home and you're living in a strong economy, what Ruben finds, or we find, is that it does affect your mental health. So the host economies booming won't protect your own mental health if what's going on at home is bad economically. And it's probably to do with a couple of things. Some people would argue it's to do with maybe having investment back home. I would think it's more to do with family and friends. So if you might have parents, grandparents still at home. Maybe they're suffering in terms of unemployment or struggling to make ends meet. And maybe you're flying in London, but you don't forget about your past. You don't forget about your family. So I think that's probably what we're seeing. We have another paper in Industrial Relations Journal that looks at caring duties. So caring duties and home duties as well. So if you're caring for somebody in the household or if you're having to do housework. So it's like having an extra job. We're aware of it. The outcome was that it does affect people's mental health in the UK, and it was worse for men than for women. And this paper's with Julia. Julia's currently working on her MSc at the moment in Maynooth. And Julia's analogy was that she felt that the outcome was worse for men because of the stigma. So traditionally, maybe it was seen as a female job to be doing the caring in the household. So that's a burden, and that it does affect your mental health. But if you're a man, the outcome was worse. And Julia was arguing that maybe it's to do with the reverse of roles, and maybe it's to do with, a male feeling less masculine because of the work he had to undertake. We also have a paper. See, Addy is here with us today. We have a paper with Addy, Jenny, myself, Sean O'Reilly in UCD, and Alba, who's a postdoc in Maynooth. So we were looking at material deprivation, and in particular, we were looking at child deprivation. So people who are self-employed and who were experiencing financial distress were experiencing higher risk of childhood. Their children were at higher risk of facing deprivation. So things like having meals, like 3 regular meals a day, having a coat, the ability to pay for birthday parties, that type of stuff, really kind of basic stuff. But it was recorded in the data set, and we found a link that's under review at the moment in the ABS 3 journal. Then myself and Jenny, again with Sean and with Andres on the call, we put in there was a call from the International Small Business Journal looking for guest editors to put together a special issue. So we put that together a few months ago. They got back to us last week, and they've agreed to let us guest edit a special issue next year. We won't say too much about it, but it's kind of somewhere between sustainability and mental health combined with self-employment. So when we got our act together with that, we'll make a formal announcement and people will be welcome to submit. And then we'll just finish on that the work we talked about today, a lot of it's coming through PhD channels. and recruiting good PhD students. So we're finishing on that note that the work with the PhD student is ongoing. A lot of them are doing interesting work, and things build. Students can see what we're doing, and students who are interested will align themselves with the work we're doing. So it's very rare for me to get a request from a PhD student to look at something that would be straight down the middle economics or straight down the middle finance. They tend to have something different to say, or they want to research something different. So I think that's enough from Jenny and I. Unless, Jenny, you want to say anything else about the future papers?
No, I mean, I suppose just a very short comment is that I think what led to this is that the area of finance was becoming quite stead in that they were, everybody was looking at the same thing, ESG, sustainability, and there was a huge emphasis on very large data sets. And it became quite frustrating, I suppose, for us. So what we decided to do was move into the margins where we thought there was more interesting topics and we had maybe more freedom to look at topics that we wanted to look at. And so that's maybe what led us to go into this area that we, that was just a point that led us into this area. I'm just going to stop sharing this.
No, that's true. And also to further that point, reviewers and editors seem they're less picky about things because the research questions are practical and applied in nature and they're addressing real world problems. You get less review and resubmit feedback on modeling and data and more about maybe theory and have you thought about this? Have you looked at psychology? Have you looked at this? So it's the reviewers tend to be very practical in nature as well, and we're less constrained probably from a methods perspective than maybe if we, as Jenny says, economics and finance, it's big data, it's probably expensive big data, it's probably AI, it's machine learning as well. So larger universities will obviously have a comparative advantage in recruiting PhD students and recruiting postdocs in buying bigger data sets, or paying for data collection. So this is our approach. I suppose this is our response to that market.